The year 1967 was a year of change and innovation. The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Paul Newman starred in Cool Hand Luke, Dr. Christian Barnard performed the first successful heart transplant, NASA launched the Saturn V, and Russian watch company Vostok introduced the iconic Amphibia watch, one of the most reliable watches ever built. Some people say this watch is just a toy, and it can't survive anything more than a soak in the bathtub. But those in the know better. That coming up next. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Ministry of Defense tasked watchmaker Vostok and its Chistopol factory with making a special watch that could be used by their frogmen during dives, and in particular for submarine rescue missions. Vostok assigned this task to two veteran designers, Mikhail Fedorovich Novikov and Vera Fedorovna Belova. What was asked of them must have seemed overwhelming. According to Novikov, they were given an extremely stringent set of criteria for this new watch. First, the case had to be made from stainless steel. This one might seem like it would be a simple task, but Vostok had already been trying to work with steel and it hadn't been going well. Vostok watches were traditionally made from brass, and since stainless steel is much harder, their machinery kept breaking down, the case edges were too rough, and for some reason, the lugs kept snapping off during construction. Second, and this was by far the most difficult task, the new watches had to be made using no foreign patents. The last thing the Soviets wanted was to have to pay royalties to decadent imperialist Western countries every time they made a watch for the Russian Navy. So, even though good dive watch designs already existed, they would have to do everything differently. Third, the watch would have to withstand what Novikov called aggressive environments. 200 meters ocean depth, magnetism, extreme heat, and extreme cold. Fourth, it had to be inexpensive to produce. These would eventually be made in large numbers for the military, so an expensive watch was not an option. Finally, it had to be capable of being mass-produced. Unlike Swiss dive watches, which were produced using the artisan method by individuals, this watch would have to be mass-produced on an assembly line. It quickly became apparent that Vostok had chosen the right people in Novikov and Belova. They immediately started testing Swiss dive watches well beyond the 200-meter mark, putting them in pressure chambers until they exploded, banging them around, and they saw room for improvement. As they saw it, the Swiss brands used the brute strength approach, thick, expensive glass and thick steel. They felt they could accomplish the same result at a vastly cheaper price using innovative engineering. One thing they changed was the crown and stem to create the famous Vostok floppy crown. In the dive watches of Western countries, the crown is protected from knocks and bumps by protectors on the case. But Novikov and Belova found that if the crown does get hit, the stem frequently bends, resulting in an imperfect seal. In the Amphibia, they made the crown floppy so that it can take a smack without bending the stem or damaging the movement. Another thing they invented was a new system for the glass. Swiss watches use thick crystal tightened down strongly. If the glass distorts while diving, it shatters. The Amphibia uses a different approach. It uses an acrylic crystal. The acrylic is 3 millimeters thick instead of the 2 millimeter acrylic used on its cousin, the Kommandirsky watch. It's cast and then ground to specifications. More importantly, It has a cross-section that is designed to distort at depth, like a flexible arch. At sea level, the crystal fits snugly but not tightly. When submerged, pressure compresses and flattens the crystal, tightening the seal at the edges. The greater the depth, the tighter the seal. Last but definitely not least is the caseback. Novikov noted that in watches from shameless capitalist countries, the entire caseback screws into the case with a slim rubber O-ring underneath. If the caseback isn't screwed on tightly enough, it leaks. If the caseback is screwed on too tightly, the twisting motion can shear away and damage the O-ring. And at high pressure while diving, the entire caseback twists downward, further squeezing the O-ring. Novikov said that in their tests, under 20 atmospheres of pressure, a rubber O-ring compresses as much as 20 or 30%. There was always a chance that the O-ring wouldn't bounce back when the diver resurfaced, known as residual deformation, resulting in water damage. Novikov and Belova came up with an ingenious solution. In their design for the Amphibia, the rubber O-ring is wide and flat, like the seal on a mason jar. A great deal of research went into this O-ring to find a type of rubber that has a smooth surface, is tough, and has exactly the right amount of flexibility. The back plate simply sits on top of the O-ring. This back plate, by the way, is 1 millimeter thick, twice the thickness of the back plate on the Komandyrski. This back plate doesn't screw down, which could damage the O-ring. Instead, a separate ring screws down the caseback. At depth, the back plate presses down on the rubber gasket, strengthening the seal. When a diver resurfaces, the large O-ring bounces back like a rubber ball, and the whole caseback will be the same tightness as before the dive. So, that's the development of the watch and its innovations. But what about the details of this particular watch, known in the West as the Scuba Dude, or in the East as the Frogman? And what are its flaws? There are, in fact, quite a few. First, the Amphibia bracelet. This bracelet has been called the worst bracelet in the world. It isn't, but it is pretty bad. First, it has horrible loose open end links. And since the whole bracelet is loose and chrome-plated, it makes a really cheap-sounding jangly noise. It does have a rather ingenious system which prevents it from falling apart even if the cotter pins come out, but nonetheless, most people immediately swap out this bracelet for a nice NATO strap or, frankly, any other bracelet or strap. The bezel is a bit of a mystery to me. According to Novikov and Belova, it is designed to time dives. However, it moves in both directions, has no ratchet to hold it in place, and has a tendency to turn slightly when you rub it or bang it against anything. So it's almost like it was an afterthought on their part, as if they thought it was good enough to get the job done. The nice part about it is, it does have a distinctive look. The loom on this watch is so-so. The loom is thinly spread, especially on the hands, and there isn't much of it. The dial dot indicators, for example, are only 0.6 millimeters in diameter. So with small dial markers and first-generation loom material, it's not particularly bright, and it fades quickly. The movement in this watch is an in-house movement made by Vostok, the 2146B. It's a self-winding automatic movement with date, and the mainspring winds when the oscillating weight moves in either direction. And it's a workhorse. I've seen plenty of these movements that haven't been serviced in 30 years. They're caked with dirt and sticky oil and still running perfectly. It's truly impressive. The reliability of this movement is one of the best things about owning an Amphibia watch. The accuracy, however, not quite as impressive. Officially, this movement has an accuracy of -20 to +60 seconds per day, which is a wide range for a modern watch. In practice, they do better. Mine runs at about ±20 seconds per day. Nonetheless, the Amphibia is not known as an especially accurate timekeeper. It's designed to be tough and simple more than accurate. Also, this isn't a hackable movement, meaning the seconds hand doesn't stop while you're setting it. So you can only set it to about the nearest 20 or 30 seconds in the first place. Personally, I don't think the movement's accuracy or lack thereof is a deal breaker. However, if you want to set your watch on Monday and have it last for the whole week without having to reset the time, this may not be the watch for you. The quality control for the Amphibia is adequate but industrial. If you get one, the parts will be well made, it'll be well assembled, lubricated, secure. However, it's not entirely unusual, for example, to find a tiny fiber or a partial fingerprint on the movement, something you'd rarely, if ever, see in a Swiss or Japanese movement. And although this movement has a 31-hour power reserve, my personal experience is that if I rely on the self-winding only, I'm lucky to get 10 or 11 hours out of it. That means if I take it off at night, it lasts until I wake up and a few hours more. To get the full 31 hours of power reserve, I have to wind it manually. Well, there's one last thing I'd like to talk about regarding this watch. Outer space, the final frontier. In 1975, this man, cosmonaut Georgy Mikhailovich Grechko, twice hero of the Soviet Union, wore an Amphibia watch during his flight on the Soyuz 17 spacecraft. He then wore it for another 29 days in space aboard the Salyut 4 space station. After the trip, he wrote a grateful letter to Vostok talking about how much he loved the watch, and he also gave out Amphibia watches to his friends. So if you want a watch that's been to space, but don't want to pay thousands of dollars to get one, the Amphibia is the ticket. I should mention, Amphibia watches have amazing modification potential. If you don't like a part, you can swap it for another one. The back plate, dial, hands, bezel, and many other parts are customizable. And if you don't even like the look of this watch, of the military design watch, there's a whole new generation of Amphibia watches that have a sleek and modern, more business-like look. So what's my conclusion? I think this watch is fascinating and somewhat underrated, even though it already is a popular watch. The Amphibia is incredibly reliable, inexpensive, and has one of the most interesting histories of any watch on the planet. Or off the planet, as far as that goes. One usually has to pay big dollars to get this kind of history in a watch. Like many Russian watches, it has a strangely toy-like appearance, which leads some people to dismiss it. But it's built for a serious purpose, and it has serious capabilities. A couple of years ago, another YouTuber, Ian Malone, tested an Amphibia watch in a pressure chamber, and it finally failed at the equivalent of 836 meters. To put that in perspective, that's 500 meters deeper than the deepest scuba dive ever recorded. So that's my review of the Vostok Amphibia watch. I hope you enjoyed it. By the way, the Rolex Submariner I used for comparison in this video is in fact my colleague's Hong Kong replica, although I didn't know that when I borrowed it, and I'm not entirely sure he knows that. Can you see how I know it's a fake? Let me know. In the comments, are links to some of my favorite styles of amphibia watches, so if you want one and choose to support this channel, please use those links. I'll leave you today with some amazing space imagery courtesy of NASA and Roscosmos. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.